And then, of course, we'll be launching our history fair back again outside, much like it was on August 15th. So if anyone wants to volunteer for that, that would be cool. We're always looking for volunteers for history fair. We're hoping to do this one as a big 250th history fair. And I also want to say that we have some of the books available out front to purchase for our talk. Our speaker today is Dr. Scott Hippensteel. He's a professor of earth sciences at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's published 3 books about the intersection of natural and military sciences. This is going to be super fascinating. Including the award-winning book, Sand Science in the Civil War, the Sedimentary Geology and Combat. His research interests focus on using microfossils to secure environmental and geoarchaeological problems, including investigating famous Civil War submarine H.L. Hunley. So we're really excited to have him today. Again, his books are available in the lobby. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over to our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys, and thank you for coming. I normally lecture to 200 students at a time, so I think I'm pretty good at projecting my voice. If you can't hear me, I can use the mic, but then I'm going to be standing here in front of my talk, and I'm going to be doing this all the time to see where I am. So I'm a geologist, I'm a paleontologist. I have always wanted to be a historian. My father was a professor. He convinced me when I was an undergrad that if I wanted to have a teaching career like he had, and like my mother had, also a college professor, that I was much better off in the sciences in terms of job prospects than I was in history. But the instant that I got tenure, boy, 180 switch from sedimentology and stratigraphy and geophysics to suddenly I was writing about the Civil War. Because I grew up in central Pennsylvania, and as a kid, I'll show you this slide. Anybody recognize these 5 beaches? That's my daughter at the top. I'll give you a clue. One of them is Omaha, right? So my father was born on June 6th, 1944. He was actually born on D-Day. So as a kid, growing up, we always had books all through the house about D-Day and World War II. And we lived really close to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And as a kid, we used to go to Gettysburg all the time. And as a kid, Gettysburg, Devil's Den, that's a giant playground to just spend the day running around the boulders and things. I didn't have an appreciation for what really happened there. But that turned me into a historian who also loved geology, and all the classes I teach, they're natural history classes. That's what paleontology is. I teach earth history classes, and now I teach about the intersection between military history and natural history, how the two come together. This is my favorite project that I've worked on. When I first started at the University of North Carolina, I was brought into work as part of the archaeological team on the H.L. Hunley. When the sub sank in 1864, it sat on the ocean bottom until 1995. When they brought it up to the surface in 2000, opened it up, it was completely full of sediment, my specialty. And it was completely full of microfossils. These little things here. Tiny, tiny little fossils, smaller than a grain of sand, but extremely valuable for recreating environmental history. Open up the submarine, they're expecting to find 150 years plus on the continental shelf, maybe a few teeth, maybe a couple of more robust bones. In fact, they find the crew pretty much intact with soft tissue, including brain material. That should not be there. But you know what can tell you about why that kind of preservation took place? The microfossils. Because they'll indicate what the environmental conditions were like inside the submarine as it filled with sediment. There was no oxygen inside the submarine, anoxic muds covering the bodies, keeping the scavengers away. You end up with exceptional preservation. And that led me to write, eventually, 3 books. I talk about the Hunley in the 3rd book. The one thing all the books will have in common, you'll see geology or you'll see science in the title. Because I'm not interested in the history of science, I'm interested in using science to interpret history. So I wrote about geology, I wrote about sedimentology, and then I wrote about, in the midst of the Civil War, I write about all the different sciences. Ballistics, I write about using physics to interpret, gunshot, sniper shots from 1,000 yards. Didn't happen the way that the history books tell it, that it happened. It didn't happen, you can demonstrate that. And I'll come back to these themes as I talk about Civil War forensics today. I came across this picture. This isn't too far from where I grew up in central Pennsylvania, it's Wilkes-Barre. It's C.F. Cook's photo gallery. This was taken in 1880 of a Union veteran wounded in combat. Came up with a new way to get around, perhaps not totally approved by PETA. I have a lab mutt at home, and I can just imagine, I can't get her to sit down, let alone. I'm going to use this as my framework to talk about all the different pictures. I'm going to start today by talking about the photographers themselves. Some of these guys will be familiar to you, some maybe a little bit more obscure. We're going to start on the very far right here with Thomas Roach. Thomas Roach is most famous for his photographs that he took from Petersburg. Took a lot of really, really grisly images in the trenches of Petersburg, and I'll talk all about that as we move along. At the top on the right is Timothy O'Sullivan. He worked for both Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady all during the war. Perhaps the most widely traveled of all of the Civil War photographers, excellent field photographer, and I'll make an argument at the end of the talk today that he might have been the most important of the Civil War photographers. Alexander Gardner, in his unique clothing, he is the first of the Civil War photographers to have been identified as manipulating his photographs, altering them, adding things, taking things away, moving things. But he also, at the time, was working, or had been working very recently for Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady, the eye on history, his camera tells no lies, his camera is the truth. Matthew Brady, by far the most famous of all the different photographers in the Civil War. But you'd be surprised to know that even though he's credited as having the camera that is the eye on history, he took very few of the photographs that he's credited with taking. He got a lot of credit for taking photographs that were taken by others, and I'll demonstrate that to you today. So we'll talk about all of these guys, starting with Roche on the far right, and we'll finish with him as well. Like I said, a lot of his photographs concentrated on the dead in the trenches of Petersburg. He took by far the most gruesome of all the images in my book, the title Forensics. I talk about literally medical forensics. There are pictures that he took where clearly he was trying to capture the nature of the wounds themselves and just how terrible they were. But when I saw that this is kind of a brown bag lunch, I thought I'd make a few of those pictures out, but not all of them. So there are some images that are really disturbing that I'm going to show you today. Most of them you've seen, but some of them are disturbing, especially the wounds. Timothy O'Sullivan, everywhere in the Eastern Theater. You'll read that one day he is at Fort Fisher on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. 2 weeks later, he's at Appomattox. He hit most of the major battlefields, and he was working for Alexander Gardner, and early in the war for Matthew Brady. Gardner, who took some of the more famous pictures, especially the first really important series from Antietam. These were the first pictures, the two at the top, that were sent back to Matthew Brady's gallery in New York City that absolutely shocked the public. They had no idea this is what the aftermath of combat looked like. They were used to the romantic images of soldiers fighting gallant battles, and he sent back these pictures, and it stunned people. And then finally, we'll end with Matthew Brady, who took what turns out to be mostly landscape photographs. He often would arrive on the battlefield a few weeks after the fighting had stopped, so he had a better idea of what happened during the battle than Alexander Gardner did. Gardner would show up and take pictures of the corpses in the field. Brady would show up a week or two later and take landscape building photographs. This is where it happened. You can't still see the detritus of battle, you can't see the bodies, but this is where General Reynolds fell. This is where this particular event actually occurred. Of course, I said earlier that he's credited with taking a lot of photographs that he didn't actually take. Every single one of these photographs, I'll blow them up so you can see them, but every single one of these has one thing in common. And one thing that demonstrates that the cameraman wasn't Matthew Brady, even though he took credit. And Brady and Company were photographed by Brady. And the thing they all have in common is Matthew Brady's in See him on the far left? I'll zoom in. There he is. He loves to portray himself on the front lines as being not part of the action, but I'm important because I'm actually here with the soldiers. We're under fire in this picture, right? Or this one, this is John Burns at Gettysburg, the only civilian that fought in the Battle of Gettysburg. There's his musket, Revolutionary War musket beside him on one side, along with his wife. Look on the backside porch. See him back there? The straw hat gives him away. Or landscape photos. Here's Little Round Top and Big Round Top, famous from the second day's fighting at Gettysburg. Look on the far left. There he is. He's in every single one of these. So we can play a fun game of Where's Waldo? Where there he is in every single one of these.
Oh.
Sometimes he's more of a dignitary. Other times he's just studying the landscape. Sometimes it's really hard to find, like this picture right here. He's right there. You can barely see him among the vegetation. So what got me started on this was when I was an undergrad and I was considering between history and geology. And I took a course with this famous fellow, William Frassinito. William Frassinito taught a field course that my parents enrolled me in. I was thrilled. They gave it to me as a birthday present. And Frassinito, there he is, I took a picture of him, 1992, took us out on the Gettysburg battlefield and showed us where all the famous pictures had been taken. And you can see him perched above all the igneous rocks, all the boulders of Devil's Den here. His books were groundbreaking for two reasons. One, he located where all these photographs were taken, for the most part. But secondly, he demonstrated in Journey in Time in 1975 that a lot of them were questionable when it comes to the rules of photojournalism. Most famous example that really stunned me as a 16-year-old when I was reading this is he found this dead Confederate sharpshooter. They took multiple pictures of the same dead body. You could tell that by looking at the geology. The boulders don't move. That's the same guy in each of these pictures. And then famously, Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan, James Gibson, who took these pictures, they then walked back up over the hill into the heart of Devil's Den, and they found this site. What an incredibly photogenic site. You've got boulders piled up here, smaller cobbles and boulders piled up for protection, two massive boulders on the side. This is a sniper's den. And there in the background is Little Round Top. And we know there were two Union generals that were shot by snipers on Little Round Top. If only there was a human element here, right, to really bring it home. And there's the human element. Did you know who that is? That's the same guy that was in the previous two pictures. Look at the blanket. They drugged the corpse up there. To compose this, added the rifle. And now we have what, for a long time, was the most reproduced, reprinted photograph from the Civil War. Well, when I read this and realized, oh my gosh, here we have history, we have geology, it's all coming together. This got me really, really excited. And this was 30 plus years ago. So I've been collecting stories and I've been collecting pictures, and I've been walking the Gettysburg battlefield as much as I possibly could to go out and look at these photographs. And to give you an idea of just how important this journey in time was, here's 1975, his publication. Before this, through the century of publication, the image was always described as being the sharpshooter's last sleep. This is where the guy actually fell. This is how he was killed. And then after that publication, now most good publications will at least throw in a line or two about how this was a composed picture. These images, this image was quite a problem for Frassinito. He found this image, which Alexander Gardner labeled as coming from one particular location on the battlefield. And then he later saw this image, which Alexander Gardner labeled as being a different part of the battlefield. And he realized if you look at the clothing really carefully and the orientation of the bodies, knee up, hand up, they're the same bodies, just taken from different images. And then this, from a completely different part of the battlefield, those are the same guys back there. And Frassinito demonstrated that all of these are just the same picture, same group of dead soldiers, with the photograph being taken from different spots, different locations, but all at the same geographic location, even though the captions are misleading us, because they're saying it came from north of the battlefield, it came from the first day's fighting, it came from the third day's fighting. They're all the same guys. But the one thing he couldn't demonstrate was where on the battlefield this picture was taken. Until one day he's in the Library of Congress, he's looking at this picture, which is not typically reproduced in our books, and he sees that rock on the back right. Now, when I see that rock on the back right, I'm a geologist. I say, oh, there's a great example of spheroidal weathering. This was a boulder that was once deeply, deeply buried, was exposed by erosion and weathering, and now has started to exfoliate just like an onion. And then water percolated down into the rock, got into a crack, and it froze and shattered it in half and gave us that very distinct fracture. Well, Frassinito realized in 1970 that if he could find that rock would be a geological tracer through time. And if he could find that rock, he could find those bodies. And if he could find where those bodies were, he could piece back together the orientation of all the other bodies. So he describes walking the battlefield for 5 years until one day he's in the woods and he stumbles across that rock. And there's the rock today. The National Park Service has restored it back to the landscape that it looked at like at the time. At the time that he found it, and of course I, as a college kid, had to go try to find the rock. It was in a deep woods. You couldn't really find it. It was not a part of the battlefield that was really easily accessible either. Had to climb a couple fences to get to it. But once he found that rock, then he knew this is the field where all of those different bodies had been gathered for burial. Of course, you can do this. You've seen the then and now pictures. You can do this with the geology for all these different images. There's the same exact spot today. I mean, this is what really captured my attention. What better way to connect with the past than going and standing and seeing what was there 2 days after the battle actually took place. Of course, Alexander Gardner was kind of playing fast and loose with the rules of photojournalism when he was moving a body around. That led me to come up with this, what I call scale of manipulation. I was interested in, if we start down here with truly honest pictures and we move up through composite pictures, with adding false captions about where the picture was taken, adding props, moving bodies. As the amount of manipulation goes up, the value to historians goes down. There's not really any question about that. A picture that is a composite is a picture of something that didn't happen, of a person who wasn't there, of an event that didn't take place. That's not much use to historians. If anything, it's misleading to historians. I'm going to walk you through this scale over the next 20 minutes or so. So let's start with props added, because this is one that isn't talked about all that much. But if we go back to the Gettysburg series, right? This is Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, Gibson's work. These two dead bodies, along with a 1861 Springfield rifle musket. You know what this has in common with this? Yeah, the gun, but not just the gun that doesn't have a ramrod. In fact, if you look at their pictures from that particular day, all these different shots that they took in the 2 or 3 days after the battle, every single one of these has a rifle musket, and every single one of those rifle muskets does not have a ramrod. And a rifle musket without a ramrod is basically a 9-pound club. So there's one of two explanations for this. I may have uncovered something that historians will find really, really important, and that is, I may have the explanation why the Confederates and Robert E. Lee lost the battle. No, it wasn't Pickett's charge, right? It was the fact that none of their rifles worked. Or it could be, that's the same rifle. They're just adding to picture after picture after picture. And some of these, it's really hard to see. That rifle musket is right here, and I'll zoom in on it. There you can see it. Right there, there's no ramrod. And this picture that I showed you earlier, you see the rifle on the soldier in the back, no ramrod, same guy. Now, wait a minute. Here's that rifle is now moving, because it was laying on his shoulder, but now it's laying beside him. No ramrod. Every single one of those, no ramrod. So I would argue that it's pretty good evidence that that's the same rifle that's showing up in all of the different pictures. But as a scientist, I had to test this. So just to test this, I went to the Library of Congress. I went to their Civil War collection. I put in rifle musket. It brought up these 6 pictures randomly. And when you look at these 6 pictures randomly, every single one of them has a rifle, and every single one of them has a rifle with a ramrod that's very clearly seen. In fact, this poor guy here in the trenches, this is a Roche picture. He's got ramrods all over the place. He's got a ramrod beside his rifle, in his rifle, laying across his chest. They're not hard to find. Timothy O'Sullivan didn't stop adding props either. Here is from Spotsylvania courthouse a year later. This is a dead Confederate soldier behind a hastily put together breastwork with an Enfield rifle laying across his leg. Note the barrel is down, ramrod is up. Here's the same body, now the ramrod is down and the rifle barrel is up, so that rifle has been moved. And you see the poor guy in the background, laying there with his fists clenched. He, of course, is unarmed. Oh wait, no, now he suddenly has a rifle too. It just happens to be an Enfield rifle. So they were adding props, which, is that photojournalism or is that art? And this terrible picture taken by O'Sullivan from Gettysburg, not too far from the collection where the boulder was important. This is simply too neatly composed. Your eye is immediately drawn to the ghastly wound, and then it drifts down to the disarticulated hand, which is horrifying. And then you follow the rifle, who, by the way, doesn't have a ramrod, up towards the bayonet, and there you see the artillery bolt, which was responsible for this horrible wound and the loss of the hand. But I can tell you from writing about ballistics in my second book, 12-pound shell, 15-pound shell, 1,500 feet per second, hits a human. It doesn't stop, they don't fall, right? It continues on for a couple hundred feet at least. The body goes flying one direction. It's not going to appear like this unless there were some kind of unbelievably extraordinary circumstances. So back to the question of photojournalist or artist. Interestingly, there was an artist, Alfred Woad, that was on the battlefield at the same time as the photographers. Timothy O'Sullivan took this picture of him, which I've always found interesting because they're running around, they're moving bodies, they're taking pictures, they don't have all that much sunlight. They come across the competition, a sketch artist, and they stop and take his portrait, which would have taken a good 20 minutes to complete, right? But they clearly had a collegial relationship with him. The other thing that always struck me about this picture is that he's sitting here composed making his sketches, and there are dead bodies laying all around him. Just the smell alone must have been really repulsive. The picture that I showed you of the two dead guys with the rifle and the big boulder with a crack in it, that's 50 feet to the left. The body they're moving around is behind the boulders in the background. There are other bodies that are scattered all through these boulders. Alfred Woad made exceptionally detailed and accurate sketches. And to test this, I took a lot of his sketches and compared them to photographs that were taken at the exact same time. Matthew Brady's picture of the of the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg compared to the details of Alfred Woad's sketch. And you can see that he's getting everything very, very accurate. Another picture here of the USS Sabine. This is the ship that they took the crew from the Monitor from. Look at his details of the rigging and the Dolphin Striker and everything else associated. Particular attention to details. Or another seminary here, this is the Episcopal Seminary from Alexandria, Virginia. Every detail of the ornamentation and the windows and the stairs, everything is completely authentic. And then here's his sketch that he was working at from Little Round Top and Devil's Den. Probably what he was sketching when he was sitting on the pad, may have completed it later. But in this picture, a lot of the aspects of this picture are very similar. The boulders are very similar to some we've seen before. This is, though, from a spot on the battlefield that Woad wouldn't have had access to, unless he had a drone, which I don't think he had a drone. But this would have been a viewpoint that was maybe 20 feet above the ground. Little Round Top starts to disappear the further you move back into Devil's Den. It's harder and harder to see it. So you wouldn't have been able to see it showing up quite as visibly from the ground. But when you look at this, look at the dead body there. It looks familiar for a couple of different reasons with the musket beside him. Does not the orientation of the musket look a lot like this guy here? The body looks more like this. The boulders look more like this. When you put it all together, though, one thing that occurred to me is I've been describing this as a prop in all these different photographs. Would he have included a prop with the accuracy of his early sketches, perhaps that rifle musket was actually laying there, and that's where they got the rifle musket from, that they then later added to the other 15 pictures where I've showed it. Maybe. Harvest of Death, the most famous picture to emerge from Gettysburg, also the most mysterious. Frassinito never found the location to his satisfaction. When Timothy O'Sullivan and Alexander Gardner took this famous, terrible image, it basically led to historians trying to find this location for the next 170 years. And this is an example of false captions. Here we have two photographs, both taken at the same location. Alexander Gardner is describing the 5 photographs he took that day, a couple of stereo views, a couple of large format pictures, as coming from different parts of the battlefield. What may have happened is later, after he realized that Matthew Brady, when he arrived 2 weeks later, took a bunch of pictures of the first day's fighting, Alexander Gardner and his team didn't realize the significance of that, so they added captions saying, oh, this was taken in the first day's fight, even though they didn't visit there, maybe. Those 2 photographs are taken 135 degrees apart. They're of the same bodies. Frassinito demonstrated that. Alexander Gardner labeled them as coming from all these different locations, the collection. Even though we know they had to have come from one location, but nobody could ever figure out where that location was. A lot of people have tried. A lot of people have tried. I recently mapped out where all the proposed locations for those photographs was. There it is. I'm just kidding. I made that up. But seemingly, most of the claimed locations are either up here around the first day's fighting or down here. Frassinito thought that they came from down here. I look at this map, I see geology. We have 2 different kinds of rock formations here. We have igneous hard rocks. Those are the dye-based boulders you've seen in Devil's Den. That's all this area, and the Cemetery Ridge. We also have soft sedimentary rocks. It tends to show up on the battlefield as very undulating terrain. That's what the farmers were farming on. That's where the agriculture is. That's where Pickett's charge. Pickett's charge was basically they went from igneous rock to igneous rock with flat sedimentary rock in between. Well, whenever Frassinito found this location and found this location and found this location, it was all based on that boulder in the background. And I thought, could we take these pictures? Could we apply what's called a geographic information system or geographic information science to take all the information we have in this photograph, pretending we didn't know where that boulder was? Let's say we go back and we just have this picture and we don't know where this was. Could we take all the information that we see in these pictures? There's a hard rock back there, it's not very distinctive, but there are rocks in these pictures. Could we use all of that to figure out where this location is on the battlefield? So on the left is a LiDAR image, a laser image of the battlefield. And I have here in darker colors the geology. On the right, I have the outcrops on the battlefield. This is where that hard igneous rock called diabase crops out and you can see it at the surface. That's 2 layers of data. I know that our pictures have rocks in them. So it probably came, if I overlay those 2 on top of each other, where the 2 intersect. I also know the photograph has dead bodies in it. So here's the Elliott map of all the burials at Gettysburg. If it has dead bodies in it, what are the odds that they, at the time, the field crews have lined these guys up in a V shape to bury them? What are the odds that they're actually transporting them a great distance? No. The burial site, the site of the photograph was probably close to where they were buried. I can take into things like there are no houses, there are no buildings, there are no streams in those photographs. Each one of those represents a different layer of data. And if I take all those different layers of data, and I assign them each, sorry, I have trouble with the clicker, assign them each a degree of probability, 50% chance that it was someplace where the photographers were already working, 90% chance it's underlain by igneous rocks. If I take all of those different layers of data and superimpose them one on top of another, it gives me this map. The darker the color, the higher the probability the photograph was taken, where the color is the darkest, because the most different layers of shading overlap. And there's one spot where they all hit, where every single layer. And And that layer is right here. That's on the Rose Farm. And that very distinctive boulder that I keep talking about, because I'm a geologist and I love talking about rocks, that boulder is right there. So with this known location, we were able to find it based on GIS and based on what we know about what's included in the pictures. So how about Harvest of Death? Could we do the same thing? When we add in the layers there, it's something totally different. Now you're talking about there are no boulders. There's not really any forests in the picture. There's forest trees in the background. We have more of an undulating terrain, suggesting sedimentary rock instead of a rolling terrain. When you add in all the new layers, this time 13 layers of data, you end up with this map. And on this map, there is only one location right here where all of the different criteria are met. And that location is right beside, here's where the previous photographs were taken. I propose that the Harvest of Death was taken along the Emmitsburg Road here, also on the Rose Farm close by. And this is where Frascito thought it was taken too. He just couldn't find the location. He includes it in his book under the collection from the Rose Farm, even though he admits, I never was able to satisfactorily find a location that met both views and both views in stereographic fashion when you look at them in 3D. So I went out one afternoon to this location. This was in July a couple of years ago, and I started taking photographs and comparing them. From within that triangle, there's lots of locations where if you look at it, it matches up fairly well. If you take the camera and rotate it 135 degrees and then look at it in stereo view and then in real life, this one especially. So the question then is, oh my goodness, have we used GIS to find a Harvest of Death? Of course not. Of course, this is no better than anybody else's estimation. I just came at it with a different approach. But the reason I say, of course, this is not anywhere close to definitive for the location of a Harvest of Death is the then almost certainly does not match the now. What's the single hardest thing you could do to this landscape to change it through time? I'm a geologist. I say, oh, weathering, erosion, high ground becomes low ground, sediment moves, it's probably relatively soft rock, but that takes place over millennia. What quickly is the worst possible thing you could do to the landscape to change it? Plow it, farm it, they did that. How about this? How about you run tanks all the hell over it, right? Because that's what young Dwight D. Eisenhower did during World War I. This was Camp Colt. They ran tanks all over the fields of Pickett's Charge and Longstreet's assault. They built barriers for them to try to drive over. They dug trenches. Of course, it's an army base, Camp Colt, so they need an airfield. So they plowed out an airfield. And then after they abandoned the site, later, they came back and they built a hotel here, along with cottages. How do you get to the hotel and the cottages? Well, you can fly in because the airport was still there, or they built a gas station here. There were private houses, I remember as a kid, on the top of the ridge back here, which certainly left a scar behind on the landscape. Right? They even proposed to build a drive-in theater right in front of the Little Round Top. But that's when the National Park Service stepped in and said, we better buy this land. Because this is, the Stuckies showed up here. Continuing on, let's talk about one of my favorites. I was so disappointed. I got here yesterday really early so I could go to this giant bookstore that you had here.
Oh.
I know. What the hell? I was like,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
As a rule, though, any one book that comes in the house, like 3 have to go because I'm a little carried away. I did not go to another local bookstore, but this is a local bookstore that is carrying this book that is perhaps, well, we have it in Charlotte too. It's a big chain of bookstores, and when I saw this particular book, this immediately captured my attention because this book, it's on sale, this book chronicles the war as it happened. Let's talk about the cover for this book. The cover for this book shows Ulysses S. Grant at City Point. Couple of problems. That is in fact Grant's head, but that is the horse and the body of General McCook. And that's not City Point, that's Front Royal. Those are Confederate prisoners in the back. What possible value does this photograph have for historians, and why would you include this on the cover of your book that is telling history as it happened. Now, they do acknowledge in the very, very fine print that it is a composite on the background, but why would you pick this picture? This picture is from 1900, right? It was clearly made just to sell pictures. At least on the back, well, no, not at least on the back cover. They screwed up the back cover too. Because when you look at the back cover, it says, Barlow's Knoll after the first day's battle, known as photographers on the battlefield after the first day's battle. Barlow's Knoll after the first day's battle, July 1st, 1863. That's Barlow's Knoll. This is not Barlow's Knoll. This doesn't look anything like Barlow's Knoll. Barlow's Knoll is more than a mile away from this. This is Stevens Knoll. And I know this is Stevens Knoll because when I look in the background of this picture, under great detail, I can actually see the gates to the cemetery back here. Okay, not only that, but it's taken on July 1st after the fighting ended. Those are monuments. So, the soldiers were hiding behind the monument. Right? Or this picture was taken from the So here's your book that tells the Civil War as it actually happened, and the front and the back cover are both egregious examples of the scale of manipulation in terms of fabrications and false captions and everything else. Oh boy. For this quick story, you're going to see all of this, all in one, and it's all because of Thomas Roche. Thomas Roche, working in Petersburg, comes across lots and lots of dead bodies, and he takes lots and lots of gruesome pictures of people bleeding from the nose, people that had head wounds, people that had been cut down very, very late in the war. And then he comes across this body, and his caption describes this poor soldier. This is a Confederate infantryman that was cut down not too far from Fort Hell, as they called it, during the closing days of the Civil War. And then he takes this picture, probably about 20 to 30 minutes later. This picture, he now labels it as being, this is a Confederate artilleryman that has been killed. And how do we know he's an artilleryman? Because there's an artillery swab beside him that wasn't there in the previous picture, but now has appeared. So now the artilleryman is captured on glass plate. Then he takes this picture, and here's the artilleryman with the swab, and this time, there's another dead body in the background. And this dead body is kind of special because it's African American. This gentleman is proof to some that the Confederate ranks were filled with African American soldiers. At least the artillery here was. Whenever this picture comes out and is taken soon after this, Roche realizes that the city of Petersburg has fallen and it's been evacuated, and he immediately grabs his team and they head down to Petersburg. And we know that because of the letters from this fellow. This is Andrew Russell. He was a photographer that was working for the federal government at the time. He liked to take lots and lots of pictures of trains and railroad bridges. He was at Petersburg at the time, and he writes about how Roche immediately ran downtown to take photographs before he lost too much light of the now evacuated city. And in one of those photographs, he captures this guy walking around. Does he look familiar? Look at the plaid pants and the jacket. That's the same guy who now has come back to life the next day in Petersburg and is walking around downtown Petersburg. So now Roche has added props, he's added bodies, he's basically climbing the scale. Same dead body, look at the Gabions in the background. Now there's fighting taking place. The enemy is approaching, can you see them on the horizon? And these soldiers are shooting at them. And now the soldiers, they're getting closer, and suddenly there's cannonballs and cartridge boxes showing up in our scene. So they're now adding even more props to make it even more. Is this artistry, or is this photojournalism? Because this is photojournalism. Do you remember this famous photograph?
Kent State.
Kent State, 1970. This was taken, I was 8 months old when this photograph was taken. Have you ever seen the real photograph? That's the real photograph. When Life magazine published this, they took out the post behind her. Only because they thought it made it they didn't really change it, but it made it slightly more compelling that the center of the picture didn't have this post behind it. Life magazine got into all kinds of trouble when it was realized that they had done this equivalent of photoshopping. They had used a couple of darkroom techniques. And there have been other Pulitzer Prize winning photographers
that have either lost their awards or lost their jobs because they did some tiny little thing to alter the picture to make it a little bit more compelling. So we come back to the scale of photojournalism here and whether or not these guys, where they're changing everything in the photograph, should be considered the first real photojournalists. Just tangentially related, I thought you'd get a kick out of this. I poured through so many history books, I just started to keep track of them. I surveyed hundreds and hundreds of different forms of media to look at what pictures were and weren't included. This is just a handful of the books that I looked at. But I want to know, what is the most popular, what's the most iconic photograph that appears over and over and over again in our history books in the highest number? You've seen it already.
Lincoln.
And that's a great guess. And I should add, I wasn't interested in portraits. You know why? Because you're 100% right. Lincoln or Lee show up in every book. Grant does too. I ruled those out. I'm interested in battlefield, combat, field photography. Of all the different field photography, battlefield photography, Confederate prisoner of war. You got it. This is scaled according to the size. It's Matthew Brady's pictures of the 3 red prisoners in Gettysburg. This is scaled so that the larger the picture, the more popular it is. In all the books that I surveyed, we're talking more than 50, all the websites that I surveyed, all the magazines that I went through, all the videos that I watched, this one shows up in the highest number. And of course, here's the sharpshooter's last sleep has been decreasing in size now that we know that it's been highly manipulated. But I thought I'd talk briefly about the top 6 because it was a tie for number 5. And this is the most reproduced photograph from the Civil War in all of our different books. And I think part of the reason is there's nothing really, it's a valuable picture. It shows the Confederate soldiers, they're not shoeless. They're well dressed, they're well fed. Shows though them in a way that is not at all objectionable. There's nothing here that a publisher would look at and say, do we want to put this in our general history book? Do we want to put this in a book that might be seen by kids, like the disemboweled soldiers that we've seen in Gettysburg? So this shows up as the most popular photograph from the Civil War. Second, in contrast, is Harvest of Death. Matthew Brady liked to appear in his own photographs. Alexander Gardner did not do that. At least he didn't do that intentionally. There is one view in one of the negatives. Look on the very far right. The guy with the notebook and the hat, that's probably Gardner. He didn't realize he was showing up in his own photograph. Third on the list is Andrew Russell, just mentioned him from Petersburg. His photograph of Marie's Heights and the road behind the famous stone wall at Fredericksburg. This position was captured during the later Battle of Chancellorsville, but this was a position that was heavily fought over during 2 major battles, and the photograph was captured within hours of the fighting ending. We still have corpses here. The wounded have been carried away, but they've probably put the rifles in the orientation that makes them easy to salvage in case the Confederates would push back through this position and recapture this location. Next on our list would be the Hagerstown Pike, taken by Alexander Gardner. He took a number of pictures of the dead Confederates along this position, these soldiers from Louisiana. They're on the western side of the Hagerstown Pike. You can see the fence rail on both sides there. If you look right here, the road is in between the 2. And in one of the images that I saw in a whole bunch of different books, every single caption that I came across of this image is 3 dead Confederate soldiers lying along the Hagerstown Pike. But when you zoom in on that spot right there, it's not 3 dead Confederate soldiers, it's 4. There's clearly another body that didn't make it over the fence for protection. You can see his hand right there below the rail. Tied for 5th is Dunker Church photograph with the caisson, artillery caisson, and the soldiers, the artillery soldiers gathered for burial. If you look really closely at this picture, there's a rifle. I'm not suggesting that Alexander Gardner was adding a rifle musket this early, but there is a rifle musket back there. And then the sunken road, which has always hit home with me, because the famous picture of the sunken road with the dead Confederates includes in some of the images the 130th Pennsylvania, which I had a ancestor that was part of the burial crew that fought at Antietam. always hit home with me because I know from just doing a little bit of research that he was a carpenter. He went to Harrisburg, signed up. Less than 2 weeks later, he was burying dead Confederates after he had been participating in the vicious fighting here. 2 weeks later, at some basic training. Very, very good chance he'd never fired a rifle before as a carpenter. Anyhow, in some of these pictures, if you look closely in the background, you see these blurry images. These are the burial crew at work. In some of these images, you see that the dead bodies are so tightly packed. Here's the sunken road, that it was said you could walk across the road without ever stepping foot on the ground. The famous carpet of death scenario. And this will later make its way the whole way back here, where you could walk across the battlefield without ever stepping foot on the ground while just walking on the dead bodies. That later shows up over and over and over again for the cornfield, Miller's cornfield. That's a 40-acre cornfield that was so heavily covered in dead that you could walk across it in any direction without ever stepping on the ground. Except in my second book, there's no way that happened. And I can demonstrate if you just start running the numbers. You could take all of the dead from the entire Battle of Antietam and bring them to the cornfield, and they couldn't cover the cornfield. And later we see this carpet of death at the wheat field at Gettysburg, at the Carter grounds in Franklin, at Pickett's Charge. You could take all of the dead from the entire Civil War and bring them to the fields of Pickett's Charge, and you couldn't get close to covering the fields of Pickett's Charge. So it's time to I know the soldiers were describing the horror of what they had seen, but it's time for the history books to stop repeating that particular one. Or the rivers running red with blood. Not the Mississippi, no. The bullets falling like hail. Let's jump back here to finish up here by talking about the most popular versus the most important. And here we go from objective. I'm no longer counting things. I'm just going to throw in some personal opinion here. This is the most reproduced photograph from the Civil War, and it's certainly very important. There's been an argument over which side built these breastworks. But if you look really closely, geology alert, here's dirt. There's all kinds of dirt piled up on this side, but none on this side. The dirt was piled up to stop artillery rounds that were coming from Cemetery Hill. So this is clearly built by the Confederates, probably on the third day of the battle, just anticipating an attack. This picture, incredibly, incredibly important, historically certainly important as well. Does it diminish it at all that I can actually go out and find that exact location today? Does that enhance the historical value of the photograph, or does that diminish it? Because let me show you another and ask that question again. You recognize this. We can walk to this, right? This is Fort Sanders. Fort Sanders today, there's absolutely nothing left except a sign, but it's a residential neighborhood. Does that not make this a much more valuable photograph to historians, that we can see what Knoxville looked like during the fighting? How about this one? This is Little Round Top. This is a Timothy O'Sullivan photograph. And I looked at this photograph many, many times. I bet a lot of you have never seen it before. Do you realize that in this photograph, there's actually a we find that same location right here. Look here. Zoom in. That's probably the burial crew headed towards this soldier. On this part of the battlefield, they didn't so much bury them as they piled rocks on top of them, because of the geology, the bedrock is just too close to the surface. This, I argue, is the most important photograph from the Civil War for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it took place immediately after the fighting stopped, not bloated bodies from days later. But this is what the fighting looked like at an incredibly important battle site from two different battles. Before the bodies had been moved, well, the only thing that's really been added here or modified is the rifles have probably been moved. You can see that the hammers and the actions are kept out of the dirt because they're probably going to try to reuse these rifles later. This was taken by Andrew Russell, famous for his pictures of bridges and trains. I'd argue that he took the most important photograph from the Civil War. An incredibly compelling picture that is a lot like some of the pictures from the Hagerstown Pike, in that your eye is drawn towards the back right.
Or this picture. This is another location that's completely gone today. This is from Petersburg. For this particular location, the only thing that's missing is a human element, but all of these gabions, all the apatite, the frieze, everything else here has been lost to development. Is this an important picture? Would it be more important if it had a few bodies in it, to give it a human element? Or a rifle, to give it some immediacy? Whoa, there's the same location, and now they're dead bodies. But look closely at those dead bodies. Anybody look familiar? Is that not the assistant and Thomas Roche? But then the question came about, wait a minute. If that's a photographer and his assistant, then who took the picture? No self-timers during this time period. Who took that picture?
Some dead guy.
Well, I remembered back to, do you remember whenever this guy showed up in downtown Petersburg? It's because we have letters from Andrew Russell, who took the stone wall picture. And he said, boy, Roche took 30 pictures and then hightailed it downtown. Well, Andrew Russell was there, and we know he's a good photographer. So perhaps the photographer that took the most important picture from the entire Civil War also took the silly, stupidest picture from the Civil War. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there. Anyhow, thank you for your attention. I don't know how much time I have for questions, but I appreciate it. I hope you'll forgive my composite.
Yes.
I wanted to combine the most important. And Tennessee was great. They did exactly what I asked them. I love it. Get your attention.
Didn't have, Matthew Brady had an assistant take his.
Absolutely, he did. He had a whole team. He had a whole team working. And in a couple of the photographs, members of his team show up as dead soldiers, which is often overlooked. But yeah, he had. By the end of the war, it's argued that his vision was so poor that he could no longer operate the camera, and that's why he started appearing as the coordinator and having his assistants taking the pictures for him.
So the pictures he's in.
He was there. They're his pictures.
Yeah.
But remember that he had a penchant to throw his name on things, especially Alexander Gardner's work, and that's probably had something to do with why they split after
And
Antietam.
was Gardner once upon a time an assistant of his?
Yes.
So there might be some jealousy there.
Well, the jealousy comes from the fact that Alexander Gardner takes all those horrible pictures of the Hagerstown Pike and the Dunker Church and the Sunken Lane, sends them to New York City, and Brady published them as Brady and Company with no mention of who took the photographs. Later, whenever Alexander Gardner opens his own gallery, he always is careful to say, positive by this person, negative by this person. So he's giving credit to the person that printed it and the person that took the picture. Alexander Gardner, very famously, after the war, produced the first collection of photographs called his sketchbook. He picked the 100 most important pictures from the war, put them together in a gorgeous leather-bound album, sold them for what today would be like $1,500. They didn't sell real well because people were kind of over the Civil War at this point, but it's a masterful collection. And in that 100 photograph collection of what he considered the best photographs from the Civil War, he included 14 of his own, 10 of his brother James, and Timothy O'Sullivan, 44. So it's clear who Gardner thought was the most important photographer from the Civil War. Go ahead.
Just a comment from you, if from your studies. Impressions between illustrators and photographers?
Illustrators had the advantage that they could make a quick sketch of something, fill it in later. Illustrators had the advantage of being able to take action shots. With the slow shutter speed of the photographs during the time, it's always been argued that they couldn't actually capture true scenes of battle because you needed 3, 5, 10 seconds. Click, everybody has to stand perfectly still. If you read my book, I make the argument, and I actually did a study on this, that most of the shutter speeds were much, much closer to a half second to a second than they were to 10 seconds. And I also make the argument that the reason that they didn't capture the combat shot isn't because they didn't have a camera that could capture the combat shot. It's because they didn't want to get shot, right? Because even the sketch artists are talking about, there's one famous sketch artist that, there goes the book out of his hands. So that's a basic comparison. But I would also argue that they're much closer than you would think, especially when you take the manipulation into account that's showing up in the photographs. And even the photographs before they get into the newspapers have been modified once again as they're being carved to go into the newspapers.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Please, I have a very boring historiographical question. I'm really interested in your scale of manipulation. And have you considered, for instance, that this would have applications outside the Civil War? It's the first question. Like, for instance, you're familiar with the controversy around Irish Chang and her work on Nanking. And then also, as we move into the AI age, I mean, a scale of this work will be very important, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm thinking of the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
At Ujima, where they shot that, like they had them pose over and over and over again to get the exact shot.
Yeah.
That's an event that happened that they kind of recreated. Of course, this is applicable to, we saw I kind of hinted at the photograph. There was a photograph taken of a Syrian fighter where he's in the trenches. He's got an AK-47, and in the unaltered photograph, you can see a video camera is laying at his feet. And the photographer who won the Pulitzer Prize for the picture edited the camera out because it's a little tiny bit more compelling if there's just the trenches there. When they found that out, that he had simply taken out a camera, he lost his job with the AP and he lost his Pulitzer Prize. Profound effects for AI.
Yeah.
But my goodness, I'm teaching an online class this summer. Don't get me started on AI. Any other questions, please?
Just a comment that the books are available at the front desk, if anybody's interested in purchasing a copy.
You have to sign them.
It's gotta be around inside.
Did you say that the famous Iwo Jima flag raising was posed?
Mount Suribachi, is it?
Yeah.
With the flag,
Yeah.
we have a monument that we're about to build a giant arch over top of. Yes, the photographers saw them raising the flag, either didn't have his camera ready or took a photograph that he wasn't pleased with the composition and had them repose it again and again to get it exactly.
Well, what about the video that was taken simultaneously? There's a video, well-known video.
I don't, again, his question, I threw that out there because I know that picture was at least in part staged. But
That's where I'm surprised with that, because there is a simultaneous video, color, two correspondents taken at the same time. When you compare the two, it matches. What's top, the photograph matches the video.
I'm not gonna argue, but what I'm gonna say is that I think that originally, the original flag went up, if I remember, do you know?
Oh, the
Much
original, you're
smaller
talking the first flag,
flag.
first flag or the second flag?
Again, that's what I'm saying, I think there was a smaller flag that went up originally.
It did, yeah.
I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm saying that the photographer had to
Oh.
put up like a larger picture. It absolutely happened, there's nothing, but it didn't happen the way that we think of it happened, is these are the first guys that were up there that did this.
Well, the first photograph could have been
Yeah.
staged.
Yeah.
I know what it looks like.
No argument. Any other questions? Please.
Question. Well, actually, Jude, do you see these photographs, everything else, kind of the original source of kind of like what yellow journalism would become? And what I'm saying is that stage photos, we talk about, the blowing up of the battleship Maine, and yellow journalism from the newspapers and everything else, getting upset at Cuba. And the other question kind of off of that is, a lot of these pictures being manipulated, was it to show more of the horror of the battlefield? I'm saying getting these bodies, moving them around, and was more pictures manipulated with Confederate dead or Union dead?
Confederate dead because the Confederates were buried second.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the layers in finding the harvest of death was this land occupied by the Confederates during the battle, excuse me, because then the bodies would have been less likely to be interred. And that's why they'd still be exposed for the photographers to take them. To step back to your excellent question, the one thing I didn't talk too much about is the motivation for taking these photographs and adding props and adding a human element in economics. Gardner saw when he sent back his pictures to Matthew Brady's gallery, the sensation that occurred, and they sold. So that's why there's
In the book I include, there are a million pictures of dogs, there are a million pictures of soldiers doing silly things, and there are a million pictures of the aftermath of battle, which are kind of, they're engrossing, but they're also disturbing, and they sold.
So it's a kind of a scale of economics.
I think it is. Yeah, I think the manipulation was economically motivated. Yeah, I mean, think about the sharpshooters last night. Alexander Gardner takes this picture, he sees the site, they add the body, they add the rifle. He puts it in his sketchbook. And when he writes in his sketchbook a description of a sharpshooter's last rest, he has this whole flowery pose about during Lincoln's dedication of the cemetery, he walked back down and found that site again. And there was a skeleton and a rusty musket. Are you kidding?
Now wait, you said the sketch artist will
No, this was the photographer that put it in his sketchbook.
in his.
It's very confusing. Alexander Gardner, I think, he chose sketchbook. His sketchbook of the Civil War was his photographs. It's very confusing. I think he in part did that with a nod towards the sketch artists at the time and the fact that they could capture battle scenes and he couldn't.
Well, because they didn't have a tradition of photo albums.
No, it was the first, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a collection of this book, and they consider this is the first compendium. It's the first coffee table book that has ever been produced. The problem was, it was 1866, and people did not want to go and look at dead people from the previous 5 years. They were, let's move on. So it sold enough to make back his money, but it was extremely expensive, because they were actual photographs in the book.
And he lived in New York. Or his studio, Gardner.
Gardner's studio was in Washington, D.C. Matthew Brady opened a studio in New York, 1862. He opens a second studio, this one's going to be in Washington, D.C. He hires Gardner to run that studio. He and Gardner split after the Battle of Antietam in the fall of 1862. Gardner, right down the street, opens his own studio to compete. And he steals away most of Brady's really good photographers at the same time.
And that photo, sharpshooter, not that one, the sharpshooter one,
Sharpshooter one was taken by Alexander Gardner, but it was,
about date.
you know why he could get to Gettysburg faster than Brady's team could get there? Because he was in DC and Brady was in New York. So he shows up July 5th, July 6th. Brady doesn't show up until 2 weeks later. Brady shows up, gets some local historians and said, tell me what to take pictures of. The historians have figured out what happened during the battle. 2 weeks after, they take pictures of Culp's Hill, they take pictures of everything except Pickett's Charge for some reason. Meanwhile, Alexander Gardner, who arrived the day after the fighting ended, the local townspeople, there was fighting down there, and there was fighting over here, but they didn't know, the significance of what had happened where at that time. So Gardner focuses on bodies, Brady focuses on landscapes and buildings. It is a mystery though why no one took any photographs of Pickett's Charge, Pettigrew, or Armistead's Charge. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.